So, okay, so that's just to confirm no objections so far. So if you do just say. Okay, so I guess the key practical points that have brought us to Kubernetes, and I realize that there are other solutions that cover this as well, is it's a way of deploying infrastructure that, rather than being cloud specific, it's well standardized, it's open, it's something that's sustainable. As cloud vendors are potentially evolving their offerings, that there is a vendor independent way of maintaining this. It's also something that's got quite a natural set of progressions, from taking from something that's working with Docker Compose up to something to cloud, and then the evolution can kind of continue from there. It does have a lot of structure in how it's operated, and there is a well-established process, vendor-neutral process for evolving how Kubernetes works, and it's something that can publicly get into. And it also, we tend to, as much as possible, try and get our infrastructure into all of our infrastructure as code, so that we can set up a new platform relatively straightforwardly. So we also, where possible, like to get that deploying from CI. For any of you using Terraform, being familiar with that as well, is if we're able to make infrastructure changes and pull in updates to the infrastructure, for example, a new component, optional dependency is added to arches, then it's something that we can pull in through Git rather than having to manually deploy stuff through a portal or something. It's also something that, for us particularly, that it's something that we're seeing a lot in kind of digital outcomes tendering and things like that in the UK, so we're quite aware of. Key points around Kubernetes definition. Everything has got its own YAML definition. For those of you, I imagine from what you said, most of you have at least kind of had a look at some of the Docker Compose stuff. That there's a relatively standard, easy to read syntax compared to Terraform in particular. And we've been using Kubernetes on a variety of platforms, and one of the key advantages for us is transferability. I think Andy mentioned there deploying onto Azure. AKS is it's something that can have its challenges as well, but it gives us a very standard way of deploying. Same with EKS and GKE. Mentioned CI, but that for us is another big thing. Is if what we'd like to get to ideally is saying, okay, we want to add a plugin or change something or in an Arches project, that pushing it to Git is enough to get it live, and that's something that can happen in dev staging, etc., without having to restart infrastructure manually or anything like that. And again, abstraction from the physical machines. Okay, so we've been experimenting with this for a while. We had found that setting up running Django and so forth is fine, and then we kind of said, okay, well, can we hook in the collector as well? Well, actually now, how do we add in Rabbit and make sure that we've got CouchDB going, and and make sure that we're able to have worker processes, and that's something that we can then just add into the infrastructure as code definitions in the kind of here again. So the approach essentially that Kubernetes uses to allow simplified service discovery is that the individual services are separated out, and they can be addressed on rep requests. Anything that DNS resolves, they can have their own IP addresses, and those will route through to however many replicas. So if you scale out an Nginx server, or as a reverse proxy, say, that Kubernetes will handle the routing between them. Also, Redis, for example, if we want to scale out Redis, we can say how many we want, and then Kubernetes will manage all of the routing, so that we're not having to really think much about that actual process. And I think Chantal, you touched on it as well there, is that one of the big advantages is if we can separate out the stateful and the stateless, then scaling becomes extremely straightforward. Also, maybe touch on this a bit, is doing things like auto scaling based on custom metrics and things like from Django and so forth. I had mentioned in chat there Minikube. I did spend Saturday and Monday trying to brush up some stuff and get it working on Minikube. I did get there yesterday, which I will show you. There's still a couple of things to go, and it's actually quite a good chance for me to show you where I hit a couple of challenges, and I'd be curious to know if those are things that I'm doing wrong, or if they're things that would be good to find out addressing. In particular, it's worth maybe highlighting Minikube on my host laptop, for example. It runs a virtual machine. On that virtual machine, it runs one Kubernetes node, that is one Kubernetes VM, and but other than that, it's a perfectly normal Kubernetes cluster running on a VM in your machine. So it's a great way of testing deployments and so forth like that. And it's probably the Kubernetes equivalent to Docker Compose, but as it runs in a VM, obviously there's more setup steps. Another component that we are very keen on in general is Helm. And Helm is sort of the Terraform of Kubernetes world, in that we can define, this is what an Arch's project like. Some of you may have seen the chats where we've been trying to put together a so-called Helm chart, which can then be pulled in, and you can say, okay, I want to install Arch's project on my Kubernetes cluster, and it just pulls everything in, sets up, HDB, Redis, Elasticsearch, etc., etc. So we'll come back to what we've got in a bit anyway, but a little example of some code. Each process runs in a pod. Pod is normally one, but can be more containers, so just as if you're running them locally. And if it's more than one container, normally they're extremely closely related. So something like a process and the log exporter for that process can run together. And in that case, we can add some labels to it. Kubernetes is great for being able to manage things with metadata. So, filtering things by labels, pulling out logs by labels, tweaking, updating, rolling out deployments, separating things out, giving permissions, etc., using some of that metadata. And then the rest is actually stuff that should be relatively familiar from Docker. So you've got an image, your container has a name, and it's got certain ports that are accessible outside of the pod, or in this case, container. Also have let's make it better. We also have a service. Let's see what a little bit here. So and as I mentioned, a service gives a way that even if we've got multiple pods or multiple Nginx instances to load balance between, a service gives us one way, one particular DNS entry that we can target, and the load will get shared between them. So here we've got Nginx, and that will be able to load balance between as many pods instances of Nginx. This is particularly important in the context of deployments, where we can define take that definition. I mentioned we can have multiple pods, multiple instances of Nginx. Deployment is essentially the grouping of those, and we can say how many replicas we want. We can scale that up or down and make that auto scale, and a little bit like an auto scaling group in AWS or so forth. And then we define a template that can be deployed that describes how each pod should look. And that when we update those, Kubernetes is smart enough to be able to roll out a deployment by restarting one at a time without killing them all at once, that sort of thing, so that it can check things are live and healthy before killing the next one, and allows us to do zero downtime on the deployment. Yes, okay. And the way that's deployed is through Helm install. Ideally, we'd like to do this in CI, but we can show a little bit being done manually locally. And we put together a series of those YAML files with template language. And we put together a configuration file that maybe has specific settings for a given environment, for example, the domain name or the Arches project name, that sort of thing. And then that creates all of the Kubernetes entities, like those deployments and services and so forth. And this top bit here on the left-hand side, obviously, we've got potentially secure configuration. On the other side, we've got a pile of templated YAML files, and those templated YAML files can live in Git. And so we have our infrastructure as code. We can kind of evolve that without actually having to store passwords and so forth, obviously. Okay, continuous integration. We tend to work mostly with GitLab. We work with GitHub, and that's both of them working quite nicely with building Docker images, pushing the Docker images, and then updating Kubernetes to pull those in, so that do they get deployed, then we can watch that go on through, and also that we can trigger jobs on the cluster. For example, those kind of maintenance commands and arches we might need. So a few considerations that we've kind of picked up on. You'll see there's more in the list that we've got. Don't spend too much time on it, but really looking at some of the things that kind of cover in normal ops. Where can we? What challenges are there that we would see when deploying arches normally, and how do those translate into Kubernetes world? Are there ways that we can actually get a benefit by saying, okay, pull this in, and your auto scaling will be set up in a sensible way that is how the Arches community recommends, without you having to manually figure it out. Okay, so that's the 3 times faster summary, just to make sure everyone's kind of seen that fresh. Now, sorry, give me 1 second here. So I will, yeah. See, is there any questions to begin with, or anything on that so far, or shall we go on to have a look at something practical?
No questions from me.
Yeah, no, that all sounded good.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, obviously, if you've been doing Kubernetes stuff, that will be pretty familiar. So, but hopefully, let's see. Okay, I can talk through a bit of what we've done with kind of what we found in the Arches repo, using the Docker images there. But I'm conscious that there's been work at to supersede those. So I don't know, Ryan, if there's anything that you want to show or comment on. Otherwise, I'm happy to walk through what we've got here.
I don't think there's anything at the moment. I think our work is a little bit of a divergence from what you were speaking about, because we were focusing sort of on deploying Arches for development in Docker. So maybe you should go first, and I'll see if there's anything I can add from our work.
And scored out of 10. Yeah. Okay. No, that sounds good. I mean, realistically, what we'd like to do is try and make sure that we keep as much of the overlap as possible. So I'll show you a little bit of how we're trying to do that, because in the ideal world, we want to have a nice smooth flow of lift and lay environments, so that as similar as possible. That as being one of the advantages of Docker. So, okay, I'll show what we have here. Now, I should contextualize this. We've been looking at a POC, basically, which is fairly early stages, but doing some Antarctic work, and we kind of thought this is, if we can fit this into our flow, this would be really good. So we've been kind of working on that and iterating that, and I think it took us a little bit away from making sure we could get a project set up from scratch. So I've been trying to do that over the last week and just see how that goes. There's still some rough edges around that, but then that's why we're having a workshop, and I'm going to use that excuse and I'm going to stick to it. So let me see if I can pull up what we've got here. If anyone's finding hard to hear with background noise, do say I can switch around, but at the moment I'm taking advantage of having my laptop close if it's not disruptive. So please do say. Okay, everyone see that all right? Yep. Okay. So,
hey, sorry, I think the Zoom panel is showing black for us.
Oh, is it? Okay.
It's gone now. Okay, sorry. Sorry to interrupt. There was a black box right across the terminal, and I thought maybe it was the Zoom interface for you, but perhaps not. Sorry.
It does that sometimes. I've noticed. Okay, as long as you can all see. Yeah, you can see the prompt now. That's good. Yeah. Yes, I'm trying to be multilingual with my video conferencing interfaces, so it's taking a little bit of practice. Unfortunately, that's also decided to put the mute. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So what I did, and I'll try and get this pushed up here. So I've taken what I've been doing is working off the Arches 5.1.0 tag is kind of where I've taken the code. I've added, let me just check, one or two minor changes to try, and we're having some difficulty building with Yarn. A couple of those I think just need to be a wee bit of tidy up, and also just moving some ports around. So nothing too major and things that can probably be got rid of now. So essentially we're basically working off what's there, and that's been one of our objectives, is we want to see if we can build this on top without having to put any significant demands on the project. Let's see. So Dockerfile here is what actually will build. I'm assuming from what you said that everybody's done some Docker work, etc., and some Flax Teal focus with arches. So that's just pretty standard Dockerfile from arches. There's nothing, like I said, there's no major changes that we made to that, and we built a local version. Now, there's a couple of handy tricks that we've used for this. I'm not saying this is necessarily the way we'd recommend doing that. Again, this is part of what we want to discuss. I've started a Minikube instance, so that's running a VM locally with a command there, and that is giving us, well, it's probably quite a bit of overkill, frankly, but given a nice big VM, plenty of space on it, we can run this very light as well, but that at least gives us something to work with. So so if I make sure I'm going to keep context, kube control, I'm going to use that as the kind of standard Kubernetes command for exploring what we've got here. So here's one I did earlier. This is deployed nice and light, one instance of things and each of the components. And yeah. Oh, sorry, there's a question there. No. And the two containers that are specific to arches, the rest are all standard, are the HTTP, which is the separate Django build, and then static, which is I guess this is one of the challenges, is getting the assets pulled out in a reasonably sensible way. So rather than going down, we haven't looked at CDN approach as yet, and we thought, well, we'll start with dynamic asset, like actually putting them on an Nginx process to begin with, and that way it's easy to kind of build them into a container and push them. But we've also done some projects where part of our CI is pushing the stuff to the CDN, and then that takes one process out of the it. Okay, so to build that, we've started with started with building the Docker container in this repo as our base. We've then we've then created two Docker files to build off that. So this one here, Arch's latest, is the directly built Docker container from the repo. And we've run through series of commands. So one thing we've done is give us a user with drop privileges. We can take the Arch's project name as a variable into the Docker build. And then we run our yarn install and copy in our project itself. And the project here that I'm using is one that all I've done is gone through the quick start steps to create this, to generate this. And I've added a couple of files that you'll see in a second. Copy that into the container. Run yarn install to JS, and then we set the entry point to the entry point as it is in the upstream container, and the operating user that we just added. We've also got a static Dockerfile now. I was doing some debug with this, so hopefully it removed it. Yes. And this is a work in progress. So what I've done here is, again, we take an Arches project, we pull from the dynamic container. So when I built the dynamic container with Django, I take I call it Arches _ project name. In this case, Arches my project. It's another quick start. And switch the user back to root. Set a series of dummy variables just basically to let us run the processes to generate the yarn components and collect static files. Now there's a couple of minor modifications I made to the entry point, which is why we insert a custom one for those who are familiar with that. And but essentially what we're doing here is just trying to use that as a use once container to export all the static assets. And then each time we want to push this up to Kubernetes or to somewhere, we rebuild this container. And then because we don't need for hosting static assets, we don't actually need the full container. Then we switch over to Nginx container, Nginx unprivileged container. We generally use the unprivileged versions to just produce attack surface. And we copy in all of the static files from that previous step, and basically this becomes a container that can just serve the static images. So it's kind of a simple way of getting our static assets separated out. To make sure we can run locally, and this is probably one of the places good to compare notes with what you were saying, Ryan. We've got a modified version of the Docker Compose from the repo, which can build that dynamic container I showed. Like I said, we can pass an argument of the Arches project name into all of this. So my project in this case is what I'm using. We set some local environment variables for doing local dev. These can all be overridden, not deployed. And then we set up any relationships we want in the Docker Compose. So that lets us bring it up locally at least, on the host machine. Set a worker. We've added a run celery command there just so we can easily run the worker process for anything that gets passed down to it. And then I think we maybe added celery somewhere down here. So I lost track of where. That's because that works the same way as the Arches container or the Arches Docker Compose in the repo. Then it can rebuild the front end images, so it's handy for local dev. But as I say, I think it'll be good to try and put in whatever's improvements or modification development that's been done on that for smoother development flow. Okay. Now there's a number of considerations around building production images, building development images, and so forth. We'll talk about that in a bit. Let me just keep an eye on time here. Where's my mouse going? There it is. Oh, that's right. Cool. So I can bring that up with Arches project equals in this case my project. Oops, that was slightly further back than I thought. Right, yeah, there we go. So Arches project, my project, and then Docker Compose build, and that'll build my dynamic container and Docker Compose and so forth. I've also wrapped that into a little script here, just so there's not too much magic going on, but slightly more complex Docker build line. We've got a dummy secret key there for just for running the disposable static container that gets disposed of afterwards during the build process. And running those two gives us a pair of containers. And now there's a nice little trick we can use to use Minikube's Docker registry. So rather than having to push it remotely and pull it back into our VM, Minikube is a handy little command that we can run. And then if we do the build there, it'll build it somewhere that Kubernetes cluster can already see it without having to pull or push or anything like that. So if I do Docker images, I've got quite a lot of images there, but there should be a project. Yeah, there we go. So there is a my project static container and an Arches my project container. Now those are quite big. Well, the static one's all right, but the my project container is pretty big, so there is work for them to slim that down. For start. You'll also see that quite a lot of other images have to be to hand for Kubernetes when it's actually running. As I say, connecting here to the actual Kubernetes cluster internal registry of Minikube, so you can see a few of those. And you'll see PostGIS and Elasticsearch and so forth, which are hard to hand there as well as they get run. Okay, that's actually it for our Docker setup. I know I went through that relatively quickly. Does anyone have any questions on that? Or any feedback, thoughts? Okay, I'm going to take that as a good sign. So, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, I guess I was just, it's not necessarily in the Docker setup, but I was going to ask where do you store the like Kubernetes or Minikube configs?
Yes.
The YAML files you spoke of.
Yeah.
And maybe you're going to give me that now.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So that kind of gets us to the point where we can say, okay, we've got two containers ready to pull in, and then yeah. So everything from here on, we can kind of forget about the Arches project code. We just assume that it's all in containers, and then yeah. So it kind of sort of ideally separates it into two components: Helm and Kubernetes definitions. Docker.
So given where we're at with Docker stuff, maybe I can hop in now and talk about what we're doing with Docker, because we're definitely, we haven't started to mess with Kubernetes and Minikube yet. So
yeah, please.
So host is disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, sorry, give me a sec. How do I do that? Does that work now?
There we go. Yep. Yeah, I just gotta figure out the window. Okay, I should be sharing my Visual Studio Code window now. So just to quickly run over, this is going to be, I mean, it's going to look really familiar because it's similar to what you just showed and what you did. Basically, our goal with Docker was to set up containers for projects. So just like you guys, we took the Docker files out of core and modified them to work with Arches. We ended up, modified them to work with our projects. We ended up, because of context issues, having to create a Docker _ project folder and then putting core Arches next to our project, just to create the container to pull in core Arches, which needed to live next to the project in the container. That being said, starting with our Docker Compose here, this is Arches for Science, which is a pre-existing project. We added a Dockerfile in the root of it, or rather a Docker Compose file in the root of it. We define the container here. One difference from what you were showing is that we just pulled out our environmental variables into this M file, but as you can see, they're all very similar to what you showed, and they all apply to their various containers. Similar to to what you were saying, all of these containers down here are pretty standard containers. We added the suffix of the project because we oftentimes in development are running multiple projects at once here. So this was the strategy we went with just for simplicity, knowing that maybe in the future we might want to use like one database container, for instance, for multiple projects. But as I said, this is a work in progress, and just for simplicity, we did this. We also, for this particular project, added a cantaloupe container, which is a dependency just for this project. So this exists in this Docker Compose file, but if I went to Arches Her or another project we're working for, it might not, or we've used a different random dependency for that project. Let me see here. So I think that's most of this stuff. We pointed to the cantaloupe volume and then new dependencies. In the Dockerfile, this is pretty similar to what's in the repo, except we made some in I guess I should say the core Arches repo. We made some modifications here to be specific to the project, but not a whole lot. I don't think we added project dependencies. In the entry point file, one thing that we did is we created a settings Docker file, or we took the settings Docker file, and as part of the entry point file, we copy that over into our project. So let me see, I don't see it in here yet. Oh, AFS here. Where's our settings? So now we have a settings Docker file here. And then in our settings file in our project, oh, what are you doing here? Then in our settings file in our project, we import this settings Docker file, probably similar to what you guys are doing. And I think our entry point file handles running the dev server and stuff like that. So I think that's mainly what we did to customize it for each project. As I say, we focused on just development. So we don't have, if you notice in the Docker Compose file, like Nginx or Apache, because we're just running the Django dev server for now. Although, production will probably be the next step here once we clean up some of this Dockerfile and entry point stuff. So yeah, I guess from here, it'd be interesting to, as I said, adapt this for production and then integrate it with what you're about to talk about with Kubernetes.
Cool, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I particularly think it's I think some of the things that we've come across probably quite similar. And I know we'd had a discussion a month or two back around some of those considerations too. It's really helpful. The settings actually is an interesting one as well. Yeah, we'd found that some of the pitfalls that we came across were just trying to get the settings files matching up right, and little things like just getting the making sure that the logging is pushed into console instead of local storage and that sort of thing in that context. So yeah, so it might be worth going a bit deeper at some point on some of the specific changes and things. Yeah, there were a couple of things where when I, at least the way I was approaching it, I started hitting circular dependencies, trying to get Docker and Arches to, and I was thinking maybe it might be something where you guys would be able to say, this is the way it's set up slightly differently, but be better to follow. So that'd be good. Okay, cool. Thanks, Ryan. I don't know, is anyone any questions for Ryan or any thing to add there? Good. Okay. So I'll go on to look at some of the Kubernetes side. Let's see, 20, 40, 55. Okay, we're actually just about time, so we're doing all right. me see. Okay, that back up again. Yep. Okay, cool. It's great because I've got Ronan opposite me here, so he's able to nod every time I ask a question instead of me waiting for 7 months. So okay, that's Arch's trial folder. Like I say, I've added a couple of things to that. Similarly to what Ryan was saying, we've made a couple of modifications to the entry point. Because we're sort of trying to go down that sort of full setup route, we've done a little bit more around the celery end. So we've kind of got a run celery command and things like that. And and so that gets added in. I think that's actually the only one that needs added in outside the project repo. You'll see there on my screen, I mentioned adding into the local settings just to force the logging. And then if I open up local settings, a few just bits and pieces here. So one of the things was having to obviously like to improve this, but making the allowed hosts broader because we're getting IPs coming in for the health checks and things like that. But we haven't quite worked out how to handle that, but obviously that needs improved. And then just pulling some of the bits and pieces from the environment. So, and that's actually really it. Now, on the other side of this, we've got the Arch's Helm definition. So we now assume that there are two Kubernetes containers, two Docker containers, one with Django and our project built into it, and the other with Nginx and our static assets built into it, called Arch's my project static, respectively. Now, within the Helm chart here, we have a values file that gives us kind of the optional values, and we've started from kind of a classic skeleton and added and updated things relevant to Arches. So, for example, we've got a domain names so that we can add those easily, and those will get dropped into the right places in the Arches config. Helm will let us template out config files in general, and then they'll get mounted in. So just because something that appears in a settings local file or so forth, those are things that potentially we could have as a template that could get mounted into the container at runtime if that is desirable. Then bit around PostGIS, in a way quite standard, and CouchDB, RabbitMQ, nothing wildly exciting. To get this up and running though, and making sure it works on Minikube, just making sure that that's here's okay. We have created this chart YAML file with chart YAML file, and that sort of gives a bit of a template for again, this is like 0.0.1 -alpha, I think is what I've called this, just to make sure it's unambiguous. But that shows the dependencies, so Elastic, Postgres, CouchDB, Rabbit. And then that points out to the main Arches repo for those wanting to find out more about the project. Then we can say Helm dependencies update. I'm not going to, just in case something goes wrong in a live demo, call me a coward if you like, but it's a workshop, so I'm going to avoid breaking everything just while I'm trying to demo it. Do a rerun afterwards if you want to see whether how resilient what I've got is. but we can update the dependencies. That'll pull them down from standard repositories, and that's things like the equivalent chart for Postgres, the equivalent chart for Couch. So those can be, versioned and iterated separately by their upstream teams. And that's great as well, of course, because it means that if their recommended deployment structure changes, which it does from time to time. For example, Redis might change from recommending deploying it as a cluster of one master and two replicas to two rasters and four replicas or so forth. You may also want to pin it. Well, I suppose in production you would want to pin it, and but it kind of gives you a way of saying, okay, well, what's the actual recommended deployment architecture for each of these dependencies. All right, so that pulls those in, and then we need to, as I mentioned, override certain local custom variables. So I've created this values-local file, which is a copy of the values file with certain things overridden, and in fact actually would have been slightly nicer if I just taken out everything except what's overridden there, which would have been better, but anyway. For local dev, I've got some example secrets in here. Obviously the point is that those are for local dev. And if people are interested, I can talk about some of the ways that we can manage secrets in production. And other than that, it's all relatively standard. Main name I'm using is minikube.local. That's the will resolve. That's in my etc hosts file. That will resolve to the IP address of the VM, and I've given the Arches project name. That will get inserted. Okay, I'm going to show a little bit about how we define what each of those processes and environment variables and things look like. Any questions on that so far, though, before I go on to the next step? Yep. Okay, good. So to fire this up, I've got a rather ugly looking script here. Let me just spread that out to be a little bit more readable. And what this does is we get a kebab case equivalent of a project name, so Arches my project, and that's going to be what we call our deployment, our release. We're going to use the definitions from the Arches project subfolder. We're going to use the default values from that build values local file, so that'll override, that's what will get pulled in for the template. And we're going to override the image names. And actually, for doing local dev, this should be enough. So if we've got Minikube up and running, we build our local Arches container, unless there's some specific requirements we have, then we can actually run this without changing anything in this repository at all for our brand new custom Arches project. As long as we've got those two repos built, or two images built. And then that can be run with Arches project name /install local. And that will give us a series of processes, as I showed at the start. So that sets up our Django, sets up our static container, and then the associated dependencies. So I was having a few issues. Well, just before I do anything too dramatic, to prove that this does in fact set up an Arches project. There we go. There's an Arches project. Like I said, I've just gone through the quick start, so everything should be pretty default. And I don't think I've created a map by default or anything like that. This is where everything stops working. No, thank goodness. Okay, yeah, but I've not configured, Mapbox access or anything. Again, that can come in by the environment variables, and that's fine. All
So
right.
this is all based on a brand new project. You've now gone through the project creation step.
Yes. So
in your
that's
container.
yeah, I probably won't do that. That actually really explaining there. Sorry. So, whoops, that's too far. So this Arches trial. What I did there was let's try to put the right one here. Was going through these steps here. So yeah, and then I stopped at this point. So create my project, and then everything, and then just went from, okay, so that's now given me this my project folder here. Now I'll push this up. I don't think I've actually got a remote on this yet, but that's, well, that's not very helpful, is it? That's not actually showing the added one on track. So
And I'm just assuming that it would be relatively trivial to add a container of an existing project to this.
yeah, exactly. So in theory, if you've got the project file, the only two files that I'm not quite sure where the settings local's not coming in. Oh, I see. Okay.
If you have like the Docker Compose or a Dockerfile for a project, you could
Yes. Yeah.
slot that in here.
Yeah. And in theory, I mean, yeah. So as you said, like creating an endpoint would be sensible. There's nothing in any of, you can see the modifications there. That's the only modifications from the default setup. Actually, sorry, just let me. Right, okay, yes. I was thinking settings local is also changed. Yeah. Okay, so it's those plus settings local. And these ones here are obviously outside of the project, and they're project neutral. So those could, those could be pulled in as standard dependencies. Here's a standard Dockerfile static. There's the only parameter to those at the moment by default is the actual project name.
And then on a slightly different tact, how are you identifying and moving the static files into your static container?
Yes, so that's this build Docker. The first thing it does is it does Docker Compose build on against Docker Compose, and that's what gives us a dynamic container, which is basically the normal dynamic container with that's my project directory thrown into it and yarn run. It does a build against this Dockerfile static. It's a little bit, well, it's a multi-stage build. So everything up to here is kind of pretending to this. Okay, I need to tidy that list of ends up, but it's kind of pretending to Arches that it's running in a real container briefly, and then running collect static. So it gives it dummy values just so it doesn't complain that certain values are missing. But it runs collect static.
Okay, so it copies Arches to the static container, then runs collect static in the container, and then doesn't bother finishing the Arches install because you're only interested in the static.
Exactly. So
okay.
So up to from here down to here is running in the normal Django container that we've just built with Docker Compose build. Then this last bit is saying, okay, now I've got an Nginx container. I want to grab everything from that's just been built in that other container and stick it into my web root, and then this build container here that's been running up to here just goes to the bin.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah. So that then, so that then needs pushed up. So I'm gonna. I realize we're kind of expanding a little bit into the next segment, but that might be okay because I think this is probably gonna help stimulate some of that discussion. Does anyone have any other questions up to that point, or because I'm going to dive into some YAML files now? Nope. Cool. All right, so I go Arch project, showing you the chart file, showing you the values file, what's in the templates. So templates, there are a couple of things that that we need to set up that are our processes or our kind of like our resources within Kubernetes. Same as if we were deploying to cloud environment, we'll have to set up storage, we'll have to set up processes, and if we want to add in autoscaling and things, this would be the place that we would define it. We also have we want to be able to inject certain configuration that we might have defined in our values file. Which means, and we also potentially want to add in I'm actually not 100% sure why that gets overridden. So yeah, we do need to override the Arch's Unix SQL file, so it works all right in this setup. And this is an example of how we can override a file. And equally, this is all templated. So if we wanted to say, okay, we want to have an environment-specific variable that decides whether or not the Tiger extensions get added to PostGIS or something like that, then we can say, okay, this file here will have an if-else opportunity to include some text, and then as far as the container is concerned, it just sees this as it sees the compressed template of this in its file system as if it was the original file. So we can magically just inject files in and override them that way. And yeah.
Just one thought about that specific file. This is one more general comment. I think that is a part of the Arches installation that we really could improve.
Okay.
The Postgres, the create database, like initialize database step, I think has been a little mired for a while. Well, we kind of tried to refactor it out a bit into that file that you were just showing the override of, but for example, I don't think a PostGIS template is actually ever needed or used. There's just pieces of that I think that we could do better to pull that out. And this is a more general comment, not about your setup here, but anything. I guess I'm thinking like you're doing some deployments that reference that file. If you see other ways that could be reconfigured, because I think that's a little bit of a weak spot. And one aspect of it being a weak spot is that that setup DB relied on having a super user for a very long time. And so we didn't have the paradigm of someone else with super user credentials will prepare the database, and then the Arches user will use the database. It was everything assumes, super user Postgres credentials, which in your context seems like a default anyways with the containers, and maybe that's just fine. But I do think that refactoring that bit of SQL out a little even further might be helpful. Just
yeah, and actually, there's a broader point around credentials there. I think is really really good to touch on. And I mean, you know, like I say, we're kind of coming at this from, we've been working with Kubernetes in different contexts and trying to sort of see going from looking at the code base and see what works for us to do with it. But yeah, I mean, if this creates opportunities to do things in slightly different ways, then great. I mean, we're with the credentials, for simplicity, again, this is one of the things that we're kind of thinking for a kind of getting started with Kubernetes, being able to fire that up, you know, one set of Postgres credentials makes it easy to put it onto a Minikube instance or to do some experimentation. But then in a production setting, being able to split that out. There is quite a nice kind of paradigm in Kubernetes for doing that type of basically giving it what they call an init container that could potentially have elevated privileges, but it exits as soon as it's done its initialization, and then the actual running container is only given reduced creds. And that's the sort of thing that can be quite hard to do in, say, a Docker Compose setup or Docker setup, but that Kubernetes has the necessary extensions to kind of simplify that.
Cool. Yeah.
And actually, that's a point where generally, we, again, as I say, to try and keep this simple, we've just gone, okay, there's a container and it runs, but doing things like here's the initialization checks that are maybe things that are currently an entry point, set up to be, etc. If those are factored out into a separate container, then we can actually even look at things like, well, what dependencies are needed for initialization? What when does initialization need to run, and when does it kind of be skipped, and that sort of thing.
Cool.
Yeah, let's go. Oh, thanks, Adam. So in terms of the environment variables, these come in through this config map n YAML that I've added. So all of these names are just conventional. They could be anything really. And you'll see that familiar list again of environment variables. This time it's defined in YAML. Kind of standard Kubernetes formula is that we've got this API version, what type of object we're looking at, any metadata. But you'll notice there's lots of double curly braces, and that's essentially our templating indicator. So these lines here, for example, will go in verbatim. 5984 is always the CouchDB port. Users always admin. Again, just as we were saying, that's maybe something more flexible. But actually, with the double curly braces, we can see that actually the CouchDB host is templated. So rather than putting that in verbatim, we'll run this little bit of Go syntax. So everyone likes a random bit of Go syntax. And we will stick the name of the Helm release in there. So that will come out as arches-my-project-couchdb. And just to prove that I'm not making that up, I should be able to copy them up. Just make project end. There we go. So that's the actual version retrieved from Kubernetes once it's been deployed. So you'll see there, indeed, there's the bottom. That is templated as I described. So it's template version, running version. And all of those can be templated. Quite complex things happening with templates as well if they need to. Okay. So some of the other things that may be worth highlighting here. Ingress. well, it's a bit of a templating mess, so don't look too carefully at that in case your eyes are confused. Essentially what this will do is take out, you'll see lots of values dots, and that will pull out what we put into our values dash local file that I showed, kind of like these are our local environment variables for this deployment. And it'll turn it into a valid Kubernetes ingress before pushing it up onto the cluster. And then in reality, that looks a bit less messy. Let's go down a wee bit. There we go. So actually that whole thing really boils down to this. And what that says is we've got a host called minikube local, as you saw at the top of the file setting, it's minikube local. And it redirects anything on the, basically anything at all goes to the Django pod, stroke container, and anything under /media, it overrides that and sends it to the static container instead. Okay, I can go through more of those. Well, actually, one I'll maybe just quickly show is the worker. Again, this looks like a bit of a mess, but key thing to note is that we can override the command. So that's another copy of the actual HTTP Django container, but overriding the launch command to say entry point run celery instead. So we know that it's got all the same environment variables, it's got the same secrets. You can see that we're pulling in secrets here instead of having them hard-coded, they've been pulled in from Kubernetes secrets. So how those are managed is another point, but those are coming in environment variables, just like any other environment variable. When it's running, it will see those, but those can be stored in a vault or Key Vault in Azure or HashiCorp Vault or something like that, equally. And then we can of course run whatever other entry point processes. There's ways of us kind of taking copies of that. Now there's a bigger discussion about how maintenance tasks are run, especially non-scheduled ones. That's worth highlighting, but probably a bit of a deep one to dive into. Okay, I'm conscious that I've gone over a bit here. Has anyone got any questions on that so far, or anything they want to look more at? Okay, so like to, gosh, I really did get that. I got it wrong there. So I'd like to try and do a little bit of an exercise around how we can look at, for example, I think one of my suggestions was that we want to maybe have a stream like this that someone can get into and get something up and running relatively quickly first, and then take that and say, okay, right, the production version. So we basically got both sitting on Git and the Artifactory, which is our Artifact Hub, which is the source of charts now for Helm. So people can install one to get a local version up and running, but also if they want to kind of have a recommended community production setup with using this, we can have suggested resources, amount of CPU capacity, amount of memory capacity, all defined within the defaults, so people can override that if they want to or not, and things like scalable storage. I've done a 4-hour online version I'd set up to handle uploads and things like that, and NFS storage on the cluster is probably the entry level of that. But we could look at things like scalable storage or S3 buckets or so forth. How do how we set up as default? Maybe to try and make the most of this time. What I'm going to do is put in a link to Mural. Now, I am not the company Mural expert, so I am going to have to. I'm more used to being brought into Mural boards, so apologies if there's any little rough edges of getting everything set up here. Okay, I'm going to stick a link in here. I'll do a quick intro to Mural as quickly as possible, obviously. Just out of curiosity, can people raise a hand if they've used Mural before, please? I can't quite remember how you do.
Just a little bit. I've used it a tiny bit.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we've got Ronan's raising his hand in front of me here. I was beginning to wonder there, given that we use it every day. So, and Andrea, thanks, Andrea. Okay, I'll hopefully people should have seen the link in the chat there. So we've got some people on here. Actually got my titles here. Oh my god, let's put on here. Yeah, I haven't quite got around to looking at the okay, I'm going to do an exercise here where we're going to do some going to do quite similar tasks in two different ways, and just help us give an idea of help us prioritize on the technical side some of the things that would be good to look at. Could spend maybe, let's say, start with 5 minutes and see how we get on. You'll see there's piles of post-its. You can create your own on the left. Now you should be able to, feel free to have a go, you should be able to click and drag a post-it and move it around. And yeah, there you go, you can see them kind of flicking back and forth. Feel free to create your own post-its on the left-hand side. There's sticky notes on the sidebar menu. And what I'm going to suggest that we do, I'll maybe screen share the considerations and just get people to add notes, either things that you've thought of, things that you can see in the in that list of considerations and future steps. Just given time, I'm going to suggest we do both together. Let me just screen share here again. Oh, Zoom's getting a wee bit stressed. Out of the way. Okay. There we go. So, yeah, so things that that people are particularly, anything that you're particularly interested in, either from that list or that you thought of yourself, that kind of sticks out in your mind, and where you'd sort of put it in that opportunities, basics, ideas, dependencies, and that division is just kind of, it's very rough. If someone's put something in, feel free to put it again in another box. You know, something might be looked at in a couple of different ways. Basics being things that we really need to do to even get it up running locally, well, or actually on production. So we'll do an exercise in a second just to try and work out what needs to be done where. Opportunities, things like you know, what opportunities might we get from running on this in Kubernetes that might be tougher to get anywhere, you know, without it. So ideas, things that could be, you know, maybe a little bit further out there, maybe some of those things like multi-tenancy and so forth, and then dependencies. So things that are maybe not core arches, but that we sort of need to consider, like CouchDB setup, or you know, how we configure the collector and things like that. Okay, I'm going to set a timer. Discovered that you can now pick music. I'm going to save you all doing that, because we've had some painful experiences selecting those. Can actually give you elevator music in Mural. And I'm going to do some of these myself. Is everyone fairly clear on how that works? Any questions on that? You all seem to be getting into it, so that's good to know.
Phil, where do you which category do you need to put things like things you have to consider that might be not so much problematic, but that might kind of throw a spanner in the works, as it were?
I'd say basics.
Okay.
If it's something that would be a potential blocker.
Okay, brilliant. Cheers.
Yep. feel free to create more post-its. That'll help us. I have to remember. Okay. Cool. Okay, that's quite a collection that we've got there. So 44. Yeah, I think we're okay. So is there any that people want to talk about particularly, or kind of jumped out to them there, or that they wanted to explain a little bit more detail on, or people happy enough that they're all? Yeah.
I can say in basics and essentials, creating a new project will set up Docker Compose, and Kubernetes basics for that project is definitely something we discussed internally at Fairlawn.
Yep.
As we have created the templates for creating a project, we've and as we worked on Docker recently, we've talked about adding like Docker Compose and Docker files to our project templates by default.
Oh right, yeah, that would be handy. Yeah, and I can see how that's, you know, if once that's there, then it is essentially that Kubernetes bit. If it assumes that that's the Docker setup and Docker Compose setup, we should be able to set up a Kubernetes, you know, config that you can just fire it up with no additional work or no additional config
to
into
help
Kube.
standardize that.
Exactly. Yeah. Because I think, you know, with Kubernetes, if we can ease the path onto it, because it can be a little bit daunting, you know, and it's kind of like you've got your Docker Compose running. Okay, it's 3 commands, and now your project, as you see it in Docker Compose, is now running on your Minikube. And once you've done that, well, at least you've got some confidence that you can go on to things like AKS and EKS and GKE. Yep. Exactly. Okay, I'm slightly developer out of water here, but I'm going to do a dot vote. What I'm going to do is see if I can get this right. What's that here? Oh yeah. Yes, that's it. Okay. So I'm gonna do a 3 minutes Or maybe we'll give 5 minutes just because you haven't had a chance to read this. We're going to have to do a couple. 4 sticky notes. Yeah. Sticky notes. Sticky notes. Okay. So, I click vote now. You should all find that you've got an invitation to vote. And when you click it, then you should see, oh, it's actually started, has it? You should see that all those sticky notes appear with little pluses beside them. And if you can vote for the ones that you think are critical for being able to just start playing around with this locally, usefully, genuinely usefully, so kind of to do the sort of thing that we've been showing. So the 10 that you'd really say, looking over those, these are things that I really want to have working in my local dev. Okay. You can vote multiple times for the same one if you really, really like it. It's only positive votes, I'm afraid. And that doesn't need to be the kind of basics essentials ones necessarily. If it's something that you think really should work locally, you know, even if it's kind of a bonus to have it in production. Feel free to vote for your own. That work for everyone, or did I just? Is everyone else still voting? Yeah. Okay. Oh right, yeah. Okay, I see now. Okay. I actually can't see who's got points and still deciding and so forth, but there's 26 seconds left. So if you haven't, the next 26 seconds. Like the New Year's countdown here. 5 seconds left. And there we go. Okay. So Nero is having to think very hard about this. Okay, cool. I think I might need to screen share this, unless can you see the results? You can't really know. Oh, you can see the results? Okay, cool. Okay, great. So so we've got at the top there, creating a new project will set up. So that's one that's been mentioned obviously there. So I'm going to pull these out from, whoops. Am I actually done? Yes, I am. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to pull out the top ones here. So we've got data migrations, got 5 there. Standardization of creating, menu setup, and I guess that's both instructions and implementation that needs to run the command line. Standardized monitoring, it's an interesting one. Okay, standardized monitoring. Oh, quick and clear setup in this there. Maybe stop at 3 because that's given us quite a few things to kind of handle there. Now, take a screenshot because I was slightly suspicious of doing Mural wrong, so at least that way I can have that reference. And that's, oh, and there's a 3 default values required server specs. Okay, so I probably should have actually kept those. Can I just undo that in a second there? That was 1, 2, 3. Standardized monitoring, database migrations. Standardized monitoring.
I'll point out that 2 of those, two of them are very similar. The running Django commands and how to run command line data loading.
Yes.
Yeah, you have them together.
Same with the integration with cloud platforms and dependencies.
Yeah,
Looks like those 2 are similar.
that's a good point actually. No. Similar integration with the platforms, and what was the other one? It's all right for you ones here in the morning, but my brain's already had to do a day here, so I'm having to look and try and see things in the world. Trying to get this to do that. Oh yes, I see. Sorry, yeah, got you. Running down commands. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so we're all right. So what I'm going to do is kind of pull out the main ones there for like priorities for dev. So I'm going to take a screenshot of that. And what I'd like to do is now do a shorter one. Okay. Cool. And with the remaining ones, if we can do, get rid of that blank one, can do a prioritization for production. So basically, I'm going to give 7 votes this time, and things that would be a priority to get working before going to production. So let's see where that's gone. And I'll give 3 minutes because now we've seen that. So hopefully you should all have a rough idea of what ones didn't get pulled in there that you think are priorities. So, okay, that's now for production. Oops, I'm going for the wrong thing here. Don't be like me and accidentally vote for a label.
I seem to be having problems. It's only allowing it's kind of clicking it to highlight it to edit rather than allowing me to vote. So
Yeah, same here.
I was having the same issue. I just reloaded the page and it seems to have fixed it.
okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Ronan just pointed out I was on mute there. So just saying thank you for sorting that out. I also realised I'm not entirely sure how to extend the voting time, so do shout out if you don't get it sorted in time. We're coming down 10 seconds. Is everyone able to? Is that working okay for you now, Chantel?
Yes.
Yeah, just
one
put pressure.
screen. One screen.
It's 3 seconds, and you need to answer the question as well. So
Yep.
that's it. I'm trying to bias it here, clearly. Okay. Did everyone manage to get a chance to vote? Everyone's happy up. Okay. Right. Results there. Okay. Oh, interesting. So, realize it's 6. So if anyone needs to drop, do go for it. But I'll try and finish up as quickly as possible here. I think one of my takeaways from this, I'd underestimate how time the time it would take us to go through this. So I do apologise. But was keen just to try and give us a 2-hour window to get through things and make it as accessible as possible. In that way. But this will maybe help draw some things together and then set up potentially a second workshop to dive into specific aspects of this. Okay, so everyone can see the results. Yep. So again, there's some of those pairs. If I'm missing a pair of things that are essentially the same in the votes, do tell me. Scaling according to usage requirements, I think is top there. We've got a couple of 4s, so self-healing beside it, and these are backing up. I think that integration with cloud platforms, flavor files for different cloud providers, I think that was one that was mentioned there. I'm going to put those together and call that a 4. Any objections? And I think that's only given 24. So let's take this resource optimization in as well. Okay. And okay, I'm going to do one last one. I think most of you are still on here. So we're going to do this one for 2 minutes. I'm going to give you 4 votes each. And this is to pick any of the rest that you would like to see discussed early. In other words, that you would be particularly interested in the Kubernetes discussion if these were included. So pick up to 4, like I say, multiple times for 1 if you want. And it doesn't matter whether it's critical to deployment or not, just things that are real features that you would want to keep in the loop early on. So 2 minutes and 4. And there we go. And just the ones in the squares. I think they're the ones that we've pulled out. So I think one of the things that I'm hoping has happened here, and I think it has, is that some of the potential complexities for doing a production deployment, that we've actually kind of managed to highlight it collectively. Obviously, if there's anything else that comes up as we start going through this, then this just gives us a kind of good shopping list of things to factor in and start that discussion around. Oh, I'm supposed to be down. Seven seconds. Okay. Okay. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6. Okay, let's do the 3s and 2s then. So over here we've got basic mapping and map search, and ping teardown, and okay, ability to hop across instances. I'd be really interested if there's any work being done on that. I've assumed that there hasn't. I could be wrong on that. And then, okay, recommended tools for debugging, cool. Load balancing. Yep. Continuous integration. Okay, and then we've got the other ones here, just to highlight them. Down there. So I'll just put this in as we'll put them as would be good, which is like the most generic term I can think. I'll put these in. So controlling existing Kubernetes clusters, permissions, pages, standing with apps. And what we got here? Okay. So it's, again, that's a little bit like federation, I'm guessing. So actually, the Flax was one above. Collector. Getting local dependencies set up, and then multi-tenancy. So actually, maybe that does centralized incident management. So there's a few of those that actually kind of add together. They're probably quite similar there. Yeah, storing assets and buckets. Okay. And that hopefully gives us a bit of a framework to start working through these. And where it's only 6:10, so thank you very much. I don't want to make sure it's predictable for people, so we don't run over too far. What I'll do is try and pull those together in a little bit of a clearer form, and then I don't know. Feedback would be good here. My thinking is that we could maybe do another session looking at one part of it, looking at the development pieces there, or at least the highest priority ones. One part looking at the production pieces there, and do another 2-hour session, because I think that's probably a window that works for people, and then actually just go into the practical implementation steps of what needs done, or maybe we can make decisions there and then to begin with and give it VOC. Does that sound good to people? Does that sound like a reasonable next step?
Yep, that sounds good to me.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Perfect.
One thing is, I mean, I don't know how many people outside of Flax and Teal are running Kubernetes. I know that I'm not right now. I don't know if that would be worth a session to get that up and running, or if it's something I could just do on my own. I'd have to dive into it and see, but I don't know if that would be valuable as well.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to do that. I mean, actually, what I could do is is try and do cool thing, Chantal, is to take the example that we've got. So I obviously I want to keep this one to time, but what I can do is do a complete teardown and just set that up and get to that login screen and menu from a local VM. Would that be helpful, or would it be considerably more useful to just do a bit more and try and get it onto a GKE end to end, or Azure AKS or something, or would local be a good starting point?
I think local would be a good starting point. I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but for me, I think that would be good.
I think most of our development when we first start out with things is done kind of locally, and then we push it up to our Azure setup. So yeah, I think sort of just getting our heads around how it all works. I agree with getting a local kind of setup sorted would be really helpful.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean that's I think that's a fair point. Is generally what we would do that ourselves. I think where we've sometimes found with Kubernetes is that you end up with a slightly different setup locally than you would on the cloud, because maybe Kube has some local kind of things like you've got one node or stuff like that you don't have to think about how to put it. Thinking about it in a slightly different way, but I think that's a good starting point. If people are happy with that, that would be good. Okay, I will schedule that. Any feedback on time of day? Is that working for people? I realise it's early and late both, but
yeah, this time works for me, and on Tuesdays as well. I think it's probably the easiest time of the week. Oh, sorry, day of the week.
Okay. So potentially, if we said doing something like this in, well, I think the Arches UK meetup is coming up fairly shortly. So maybe just do it far side of that.
Yeah, that works.
Cool, a few weeks away. All right. Thanks very much, folks. Really appreciate you joining, and I hope that was interesting, and you've had lots of fun with Mural, which is added surprise bonus. Yeah, we'll look forward to picking up.
Brilliant. Thank you for running this.
Thank you very much for organizing, Phil. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Not at all. Thank you. Cool. Talk to you all soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.